Hello, everybody. We have hit the 2-minute warning. What that means is in 2 minutes' time, Parliament will reconvene to vote on the Conservative Party of Canada's motion of non-confidence. And we will hope that it goes through, but we'll see. So I hope that you all join me here. I didn't have, I always get a pop-up for live chat. I'm trying to fix that. But right now, we've got 1 minute to wait until Parliament resumes and we see just how well this motion is going to fare in front of Parliament. Okay. See what's happening here. Well, they haven't come back. They called the vote. They gave 30 minutes for the one to come in. Looks like they're not very punctual. Okay, here they come.
Mr. Poilievre, seconded by Mr. Schmale, moved that the House declare non-confidence in the Prime Minister and his costly government for increasing the carbon tax 20% on April 1st as part of his plan to quadruple the tax, while Canadians cannot afford to eat, meat, and house themselves, and call for the House to be dissolved so Canadians can vote in the carbon tax election. La période de 10 minutes pour le
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Knitsch.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Miss Landsman.
Ms. Landsman.
Mr. Halland.
Mr. Halland.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Hobach.
Mr. Hobach.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas South Glengarry.
Mr. Duncan Stormadunga South Glengarry.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Miss Finley.
Miss Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abouteif.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. McCauley and Minton West.
Mr. McCall West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Mrs. Goodrich.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Madame Bien.
Madame Pien.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Mullilo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Miss Rude.
Miss Rude.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Kurek.
Mr. Kurek.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreschen.
Mr. Dreschen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Crown.
Mr. Crown.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mrs. Falk, Battlefords Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Doddle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
All those opposed? I want to remind members it's hard for the clerks to be able to hear the names that are being called, so if members could please keep it down a bit. All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Miss Anand.
Ms. Anand.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Mr. Guilbeault.
Miss Hutchings.
Miss Hutchings.
Miss Tassi.
Miss Tassi.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Miss Chagger.
Miss Chager.
Miss Scrow.
Miss Grove.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Scarpalagia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Monsieur Miller.
Monsieur Miller.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Madame Pitspataylor.
Madame Pitspataylor.
Mr. Ananda Sangare.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Fragascados.
Mr. Fragascados.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Vancouverdin.
Mr. Vancouverdin.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Miss Dillon.
Miss Dillon.
Monsieur Elkoury.
Monsieur Elkoury.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Nakvi.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Miss Vandenberg.
Miss Vandenberg.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Hepner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Miss Yip.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Miss Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Miss Taylor-Roy.
Miss Taylor-Roy.
Miss Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Simard.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Villemur.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Champoux.
Monsieur Champoux.
Madame Saint-Clair de Gagné.
Madame Sinclair de
Looks
Gagné.
like the block is on the side of the Liberals.
Savard, pardon, Monsieur Blanchet-Johnson.
silence.
Dismay, Center School violence.
La Chambre attendra maintenant.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Okay. So the members who are present in the House voted, and now they are tallying the votes from the people who are not in the House who voted electronically. Looks like everybody is voting along party lines. Okay. I think those were the electronic votes. Oh, some more coming in. I saw one NDPer vote yes, so we'll see if there's any others. One is not enough, obviously. Okay. The electronic voting has closed. So it's just a matter of waiting to see when the House comes back, the final count. I don't think we're going to have any surprises here. I'm pretty sure the motion will not be passed. Oh.
Order. I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
Technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. Or they can rise in this House to be recognized. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Nays pour, 116, 116. Nays contre, 204, 204.
I declare the motion defeated.
Well, that was no surprise, but at least they had the vote. And let's see what goes on now in private members' business.
Ms. Anand, seconded by Mr. Blair, moves that the supplementary estimate C for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2024 be concurred in.
It's very hard to hear even myself when there's so much noise. If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of the honourable...
Okay, so that's pretty much what we tuned in for. Not what we wanted, but what we expected. So please add your comments below as long as they're civil. Please like and subscribe. Hit that notification button, and we'll see you on the next video.